and we'll go to our notes. And we were talking about the arthropods, and we're going to spend more time on the arthropods than we did on any other group. There are more arthropods than there are any other group. Notice though, with all the groups, what we're doing is I'm just focusing on a few characteristics that are really crucial. Either in a sense, things that we first can observe in this group, or unique characteristics, what cladistics would call, derived ancestral characteristics. Something that have happened, something that has come about, shared derived characteristics, I should say, something that's evolved since a group split from the common ancestor. So at the end of class the other day, we were talking about the centipedes, and there was a question about, what about the millipedes? Well, the millipedes are the next group, and the millipede are the group Diplopoda. Di, or diplo, means two, and Diplopoda have two pairs of appendages on each segment. Now, if you've had the metric system, this group is commonly referred to as millipedes, and you know that milli, like a millimeter or a milligram, literally means 1,000. Millipedes don't have 1,000 legs. What millipedes have, and I think you can see it in this diagram, but if not, you'll definitely be able to if you download the notes and look at them yourself. Millipedes have two pairs of appendages on each segment. And millipedes are organisms called detrivores, which means they eat junk. They're not carnivorous. They will eat living things if they can catch them, but they don't particularly go looking for living things. If something walks into their jaws, they'll bite it and eat it. But they mostly eat junk, either what's left over when organisms die, or a lot of times we can find millipedes in human houses. And a lot of times they live back under your stove. And what do they eat? Scraps of food that fall down in the cracks on the sides of your stove or behind the stove. Notice, unlike the centipedes, remember we said centipedes are carnivorous. Some people are actually allergic to their bites. Millipedes aren't. They basically will bite you if you pick them up, but that's just in self-defense. They are not poisonous. Most of our time with Arthropoda, we're going to spend talking about insecta. So here's a list of some of the insects. They include honeybees, bumblebees, wasps, yellow jackets, hornets, like the killer hornets that were in the news recently, ants, beetles, earwigs, butterflies, moths, bugs. And there's really only two groups of insects that are bugs, if you want to get picky. Grasshoppers, crickets, cockroaches, cicadas, locusts, houseflies, mosquitoes, fleas, aphids, lice, walking sticks, mantids like praying mantises, dragonflies, silverfish, termites, mayflies, horseflies, lightning bugs, June bugs, water bugs. None of those are bugs, by the way, lightning bugs, June bugs, and water bugs. Water boatmen that can actually walk on water. Diving beetles, Goliath beetles. It says one is shown below, but whoops, I took out that diagram. I'll get you a picture of one. Goliath beetles are about as big as your fist, so they're pretty intimidating. Rhinoceros beetles, which have a big horn on the front of their head. Stink bugs, bombardier beetles, which will shoot you with stinky stuff if you bother them. So there's lots and lots of different insects, and hopefully you've heard of a few of these types of insects. If you ever played that children's game Cootie when you were a little kid, Cootie is actually fairly accurate anatomically. Remember, we said that arthropods have a body made of segments. And if we look at insects, those segments are divided into three main sections. The head, and it's usually hard to see the segments on the head, but the head actually does have segments in it. They're kind of fused together. The thorax, which is shown in green, and the abdomen. And there are a pair of appendages on most of the segments. Now keep in mind, things like the antenna that stick out of the head are actually appendages. Things like the mouth parts are actually appendages. And we said arachnids had 4 pairs of walking legs. Insects have 3 pairs of walking legs. And they also have 2 pairs of wings. Now, if we look at the abdomen, most of the segments in the abdomen have lost their appendages. There are usually some at the end that have various appendages that are associated with the reproductive system. Well, if we would look at all the species of living things that have been studied and classified and put into a category, there are about 3 million of them right now, a little bit more every day. Out of those 3 million, 1 million are insects. So 1/3 of all the living things that have been studied and classified. Well, one of the reasons that so many have been studied is there are so many of them that have an impact on human life. Some insects, we talked about mosquitoes when we talked about the malaria organisms. Some insects, are parasites or predators. I'm not sure what you would call a mosquito, but it's drinking your blood. Some insects transmit disease to people. There aren't very many insects that actually cause disease, but there are fleas that carry bubonic plague. There are other insects that carry other diseases that you can get when you're bit by them, such as the mosquitoes that carry malaria. And a lot of insects are agricultural pests. So one of the things we need to think about is, why are insects so successful? Well, one reason is they have an exoskeleton. Now, exo means outside, so the exoskeleton is on the outside of your body. And compared to a person, we have an endoskeleton. It's inside our body. Now, notice most of the other arthropods also have an exoskeleton, but they don't use it as creatively, in a sense, as insects do. If we look at this exoskeleton, it does a couple of things. Well, the most obvious thing is it provides protection. Provides protection from predators. It also protects insects from dehydrating because it's relatively waterproof. So in that sense, it works like many structures, like skin. The exoskeleton also provides support for the internal organs. In a person, if we would look at your pelvis bones, we would see that they actually hold up some of the internal organs, organs in your abdomen and the bladder, the kidneys, the reproductive organs. The exoskeleton on an insect does the same thing. Also, because the exoskeleton is very hard, the exoskeleton provides a place for muscles to attach. For muscles to really work very effectively in moving an animal's body, they have to be attached to something hard that they can pull on. And in insects, that something hard that they pull on is the exoskeleton. And this allows insects to have very efficient movement. Think about how effectively a fly can dodge you when you try to swat it. They have a very complex muscular system, and this allows them to have very complicated movement patterns. Now, there is one bad thing about having an exoskeleton. An exoskeleton is outside the body. So it would be kind of like a person wearing a suit of armor. There's a problem. If you grow, as you grow, what we see is that the exoskeleton eventually gets too tight. Kind of like if you grow too much and you always wear the same set of clothes, your clothes might eventually get too tight for you. So when an insect is growing, the old exoskeleton has to soften, and then it builds a new exoskeleton that's basically like buying a set of clothes a size too big so you can grow into them. However, when the old exoskeleton is being shed off, the kind of the brown that we can see here, this is a cicada. When the old exoskeleton is being shed, it has to soften for the insect to crawl out of it. And the new exoskeleton has to be soft, because if it's already hard, you know, think about it, it was built inside this old exoskeleton, the brown. If it's already hard, the new exoskeleton is going to be slightly smaller than the old one. So it has to be soft so that it can expand. But while the exoskeleton is soft, this new insect that's coming out is very vulnerable to predators. The skin is soft. So this is one of the reasons why when we look at some of the science fiction movies, I really don't like some of the science fiction movies in terms of what they do to biology. There's one famous science fiction movie called Them, where these giant ants are terrorizing a town. I think it's in Arizona. And the ants are like the size of a bus. The problem is, for an ant to grow the size of a bus, it's going to have to molt its old exoskeleton. It's going to have to shed its own exoskeleton. And when it does that, it would be very vulnerable. So, you know, we would just send the army in and we would shoot them when they were nice and soft and mushy. Now, insects have an open circulatory system. When we talked about annelids the other day, annelids have a closed circulatory system. And what we mean by that is the blood is always inside a blood vessel, an artery or a vein or a capillary. In insects, the heart pumps the blood forward towards the head in a blood vessel that's similar to our aorta. And then the aorta ends and the blood just sprays out onto the organs in the head, and it gradually makes its way back and kind of bathes all the organs in the thorax and abdomen as well. Now, how does it get back into the heart? Well, because an insect heart actually has little holes in it. And the holes are covered by flaps of tissue. And these tissue basically make one-way openings into the heart. They open into the heart, but they don't open out. So think of the way that a typical door on a hinge opens in one direction, but not the other. So as the muscles of the insect contract, as the insect is moving around, this contraction compresses the body. And as it compresses the body, the blood flows back into these holes in the heart, and then it can be pumped to the body again. So we tend to think of the blood as always being in a blood vessel because we have a closed circulatory system, but again, not always the case. So here's a diagram of the circulatory pattern in an insect. Notice that the heart is actually located in the posterior part of the body, back towards the end of the abdomen. And when it pumps, the little arrows show that the blood flows forward. The blood spurts out of the head, out of the blood vessel in the head area, and then it kind of travels around the body. And there are two main organs called a dorsal diaphragm and a ventral diaphragm. And these muscles are the main muscles that contract to kind of squish the body and force the blood back into the heart through these little holes. And each hole is called an ostium. Now, insects also have a very efficient respiratory system, but it only works because they're really, really small. Insects probably couldn't get bigger than about 2 feet long. And there have been some insects that have been that size. If we go back around the time of the dinosaurs, there were some insects, some dragonflies that were about 2 feet long. If we would look in the abdominal cavity, there are little holes in the abdominal cavity called spiracles. And the holes lead into tubes called tracheae. And instead of having basically a pair of respiratory organs like people have, the lungs, these tubes, these spiracles lead throughout the whole body. So you could think of it like the circulatory system in people. In people, the circulatory system goes through your body and has all these branches. No cell in your body is more than a few cells away from a blood vessel. In an insect, no cell is more than a few cells away from one of these tracheae. And these tracheae bring in air from the outside. So they deliver oxygen to the cells. And when they're delivering oxygen, they also pick up carbon dioxide. And when the insect relaxes, then the air flows out of these spiracles. And so they eliminate carbon dioxide from their body. Now, notice that although they have to move their muscles, they have to kind of compress and relax their body to breathe. They don't have to do anything to actually exchange the gases once the gases come into their body. One of the things to keep in mind whenever we're talking about animals and how they exchange gases with the environment is animals are carrying out aerobic cell respiration inside their cells. So we know that in aerobic cell respiration, oxygen is a reactant and carbon dioxide is a product. So this means that cells in not just an insect's body, but in your body have a high concentration of carbon dioxide because they're always making it. And they have a low concentration of oxygen because they're always using it up. So when blood flows by, what happens? Oxygen is at a high concentration in the blood. It's at a low concentration in the cells. So oxygen diffuses from the blood into the cells. Or in the case of an insect, oxygen diffuses from the spiracles into the cells. Carbon dioxide is at a high concentration in the cells because it's a product of aerobic cell respiration. It's at a low concentration, either in your blood or in the spiracle of an insect. So carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cells and into human blood, which eventually takes it to the lungs where it's eliminated. In an insect, it's eliminated directly from the spiracle. But notice actually exchanging gases, really in all animals, always happens specifically by diffusion. Oxygen diffuses into the cells, carbon dioxide diffuses out. Now, this is another reason why insects can't get super large. Remember a few days ago when we had our diagram of the cube and we looked at a mathematical analysis. And one of the things that we saw, if you think about it, the surface area increases with the square of an animal's size. Surface area, that's where we can exchange, in this case, oxygen and carbon dioxide. But volume increases with the cube of an animal's dimension. So this means that volume increases faster than surface area. Remember, that was probably the main point we made when we looked at those cubes. So this means as an insect gets bigger, it has to have more and more of these spiracles. And eventually, when an insect gets to be about maybe 2 or 3 feet in size, its body is mostly hollow. It's mostly these spiracle tubes carrying oxygen to different cells. So this, in a practical sense, this is also a reason why you really can't have insects the size of buses. It's not clear to me if that science fiction movie Starship Troopers, if they were fighting insects, but it's not clear if those were insects that evolved from Earth insects. So maybe their biology was different. Maybe that's how they get so big. So there's a couple of things that limit the size of insects. Now, insects have very complicated behavior. Insects typically, there are some insects that build a nest in the ground, and they will arrange small pieces of dirt and pebbles around their nest because they can recognize where their nest is when they fly over it after they do that. When insects are getting ready to fly, an insect will usually step into the sunlight and it will start flexing the muscles that move its wings, kind of doing the equivalent of a human warm-up before it exercises, because flying is pretty tough metabolically. Now, one of the ways that insects can do these complicated behaviors is because they have a lot of specialized sensory organs. One of the things that insects have that mammals and other things don't are something called compound eyes. So here's a picture of a compound eye, and hopefully you can see this kind of grid work. First of all, notice it's a pretty big eye, but if you can see this little grid work, all these little kind of diamond little shapes on the eye, each one of those is a separate eye. Each one of those is a separate lens, like the lens on a human eye. So this is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to swat a fly, because when a fly is looking at you, it's looking at you with several hundred of these small eyes. And they don't produce a very good visual image. The fly can't see you very clearly, but what they can do, since they're all looking at you from a slightly different angle, a compound eye like this is very good at detecting any form of movement. So this is one of the reasons why it's hard to swat a fly. There are some other reasons as well. Now, like a lot of organisms we've looked at, insects have a very complex life cycle. Most of them do. And the big advantage of this, as it is with some other organisms, is if you have a complex life cycle, this allows you to exploit multiple environments. And it also means the environments can support a larger population. So insects go through a process called metamorphosis. Now, some insects go through a process called incomplete metamorphosis. And in incomplete metamorphosis, all insects lay eggs. The eggs hatch and the eggs form a nymph. And basically the nymph is a miniature version of the adult. Now notice that there have to be several molts. Since the adult is much larger than the nymph has to shed its exoskeleton several times. Now, grasshoppers are an insect that you might be familiar with that go through incomplete metamorphosis. Some insects do something more drastic and go through complete metamorphosis. They lay eggs, but the eggs hatch and form larvae. And the larva is very different from the adult. Probably the example that most people are familiar with is a caterpillar is the larva for either a moth or a butterfly, or a maggot is the larva for a fly. Now the larva goes through several molts, and as it goes through several molts, eventually it molts and it forms a pupa, the cocoon that we think of with butterflies. And then the pupa becomes an adult. Now, if you think about it, a caterpillar looks very different than a butterfly, or in this case, they're giving us a ladybug beetle. And notice that the larva kind of looks like something called a white worm. If you've ever been digging in a garden and you find these little kind of white things crawling around in the soil, that's probably a beetle larva, probably a type of white worm. They're not all white, but the first ones that were discovered were, so the name stuck. Now, if we look at the pupa, what we see in the pupa is that if we look at the larval stage or the very early nymphal stage, what we see is the larva and the early nymph stages don't have reproductive organs. They don't have wings. Larval stages and the early nymph stages are specialized for feeding and growing. When the pupa becomes an adult, there are some clusters of cells in the pupa that form the adult organs, but most of the other cells are digested. So basically, the pupa liquefies parts of its body, and then it uses those nutrients to build the adult body. And the adult body generally has wings and a functional reproductive system. And this is because where the larva or the nymph is specialized to grow, and to grow you have to feed, the adult is specialized for two things: to reproduce and for dispersal, to move to a new environments. Because if everybody stays in the exact same location, you're going to have overpopulation after a while. Now, in some insects, the degree of specialization is so extreme. There are some adult insects that don't have a functional digestive system. They can't eat any food. So they have to eat as much as they can while they're a larva. They have to store all the energy that they can away as fat, because once they turn into an adult, they're probably going to live about 5 or 6 days, depending on how much food they have stored. So in that 5 or 6 days, they need to reproduce. They need to find a suitable place to lay their eggs. So metamorphosis is advantageous because if we look at a larva or a nymph and we compare it to the adult, they often eat different food. They often live in a different environment. So if they eat different food, they're not competing for the same food resource. Remember, Darwin pointed out more than a century ago that this is one of the things that limits how many individuals can survive: scarce resources. So by eating different foods, they basically have access to a bigger food supply. Now, living in a different environment does the same thing. If they live in a very different environment, they're not competing for the same sorts of resources. So when we look at this, this is very advantageous. Not to mention, keep in mind something that we've talked about on several occasions already. You can be more efficient if you specialize. Because larvae basically just eat and grow, they can be more efficient at eating and growing than a stage of the life cycle like the adult that also has to worry about flying and reproducing. And similarly, the adult can be more efficient at flying and reproducing than the larva can. So there are some advantages to this type of life cycle where there's a larval stage and an adult stage, and the larval stage is different than the adult stage. So we want to keep this in mind. Now, there are several hormones that control molting. So let's look at these hormones. And there's 3 of them that are crucial. One is called brain hormone. And brain hormone, as you might guess, is made in the brain. It's made in a particular part of the brain called the corpus cardiacum. Corpus just means body. And brain hormone gets put into the blood supply, and then it goes through the blood and circulates through the body. Now, brain hormone is made in relatively constant amounts. Brain hormone stimulates something called the prothoracic gland. And the prothoracic gland makes a hormone called ecdysone. And notice that ONE ending on ecdysone, similar to what you see on testosterone or progesterone. Chemically, ecdysone is a steroid hormone. So we might think that steroids are only produced in people. Ecdysone is sometimes called molting hormone. And molting hormone causes the insect to shed its old exoskeleton and make a new exoskeleton. Now, there's a second hormone that plays a role in determining what we get after an insect molts. So we've got brain hormone and we've got ecdysone, and these are produced in relatively constant levels. There's something called juvenile hormone. And a juvenile is not an adult. If there's a lot of juvenile hormone produced when an insect is molting, then one larval stage changes into another larval stage. Our caterpillar gets slightly bigger. It makes a larger exoskeleton. And notice that most insects go through a very specific number of larval stages or nymph stages before they become an adult. Now, if we have the same amount of ecdysone and we have a relatively low amount of juvenile hormone, then the larva becomes a pupa. And if we have the same amount of ecdysone and we don't have any juvenile hormone, notice there's no green line coming over here. If we have the same amount of ecdysone and we don't have any juvenile hormone produced, the pupa becomes an adult. So notice it's not really the amount of juvenile hormone or the amount of ecdysone that's produced. It's kind of the ratio between them. If they're relatively equal amounts, a larva becomes another larva. If there's a little bit more ecdysone than juvenile hormone, then a larva becomes a pupa. If there's a lot of ecdysone and there's no juvenile hormone, so think about this, if our ratio is ecdysone divided by juvenile hormone, a number divided by 0 is infinity. So our ratio is very high, then we go from the pupa to an adult. Now, there are some plants that have figured out a way to use these hormones to their advantage, because we need to take a couple of things into account. First of all, if we look at leaves on plants and we look at the parts that are eaten, most of the leaves on plants, most of the parts of plants that get eaten aren't eaten by rabbits or cattle or whatever. They're eaten by insects. And remember, we said the larva is a stage that's specialized for feeding. So when we say that insects eat the plants, especially the larvae do. Adults eat some, because there are some species where the adults have a digestive system. And the more that an insect eats, the bigger it will be. Remember, we said the larva is specialized not just for feeding, but for growing. Well, if the larva is bigger, the pupa is bigger, and the adult is bigger. Why does this matter? Well, it doesn't really for males, but it matters for females because it takes a lot more raw materials, it takes a lot more energy to make eggs than it does to make sperm. So whereas a small male can still make enough sperm to fertilize a lot of eggs, for a female, if a female is larger, she can make more eggs. And she can also make eggs that are bigger, that have more nutrients in them, which means that when the eggs hatch, the larvae stand a better chance of surviving because they've gotten more nutrients from mom. So what we see, remember with plants, in the middle of a plant cell, we have a large membrane-bound organelle. And it's so big in many plant cells, it pushes all the other organelles in the cytoplasm off to the side. Does anybody remember what that organelle is called in a plant cell? It's something that we don't find in animal cells.
Cell wall?
Not the cell wall, that's more towards the outside. This is something called the central vacuole. So if we look at the central vacuole.
The animal cell has a vacuole.
Yeah, so the cell wall is on the outside and helps protect the cell, but the central vacuole is on the inside. And the central vacuole stores water. If the central vacuole on a plant cell loses its water, if you have this plant in your garden, this is when the plant will wilt. But water isn't the only thing in there. There are some pigment molecules, some things that give the plants color. If you have an apple and it looks red or green or yellow, it might look like the red or green or yellow is spread out kind of evenly, but it's really just in the central vacuoles of the cells. There are some plants that produce insect hormones, and they put them in the central vacuole of cells in the leaves, so that when an insect is eating a leaf, it will ingest some of these hormones. And there are plant cells that use, really, in a sense, two opposite strategies. So let's think about these. There are some plants that produce juvenile hormone, and then they store it inside that central vacuole. So think about what juvenile hormone does. If you have a lot of juvenile hormone compared to the amount of ecdysone, when a larva molts, it forms another larva, slightly bigger than before. So if a plant produces juvenile hormone and stores it in the central vacuole, insects who eat that plant will remain a larva stage. They'll get bigger, which kind of isn't good for the plant right now because a bigger larva eats more food. But you know, when a caterpillar gets bigger, it's more noticeable to birds and things that eat insects. And for some insects, they can only molt a certain number of times. And then they can't become, we're not going to find a caterpillar that's 50 feet long. But think about this as a strategy for a plant. Most insects have a very short generation time. They produce several generations during a single spring and summer. So if you have a caterpillar crawling on you and you make juvenile hormone, it stays a caterpillar, it stays a larva, it never becomes an adult, which means what? It doesn't reproduce. So you're kind of making a sacrifice right now. Okay, I've got a big larva on me, it's eating some leaves, but if it stays a larva, next generation, there aren't going to be as many butterflies. On the other hand, there are some plants that make ecdysone and store it in their central vacuole. So when a plant eats this, when an insect eats this plant, now it has a lot of ecdysone compared to how much juvenile hormone it makes. So what happens? Well, remember, if you have a lot of ecdysone compared to how much juvenile hormone, you become a pupa much faster. So we might have a lot of caterpillars go through 4 larval stages. You might have a caterpillar that's in the first larval stage, and when it molts, instead of becoming the second larva, it immediately forms a pupa and then an adult. What's the advantage of that? Well, if a larva changes into a pupa and then an adult too quickly, it's going to be a very small adult. So if you think about what we just said, if you're a really small adult, for females, they can't lay as many eggs. So, you know, making juvenile hormone is kind of making a sacrifice now so that future generations don't exist. The larva never becomes an adult and doesn't reproduce. Making ecdysone that the insects eat means they become an adult sooner, but they become a small adult. So they don't really have a big impact. They don't lay as many eggs, so you're not going to have as many caterpillars around to eat you the next generation. So let's look at one particular group of insects that has caused biologists a lot of problems. Let's look at the insects are a class. We're in the phylum Arthropoda, the class Insecta. And let's look at what are called eusocial insects. Now, notice that's the same prefix as eukaryotic or eucoelomate, and eu means good or real. So these are good social insects. And this is an order of insects called Hymenoptera. And Hymenoptera include three main groups of insects: ants and bees and wasps. And all of the Hymenoptera aren't really eusocial, but a lot of them are, especially bees and ants. So let's think about what you see when you look at a typical beehive or an anthill, true. Well, if you look at a beehive, all the bees in the hive are females. There are no males, except for 2 or 3 weeks during the year. Not only are everybody in the beehive, are they all females? They're all sisters. That is, all of them except one female, who's the queen. And she's the only female who reproduces. Now, on the other hand, none of the daughters rebel and try to produce their own daughters. They work and they help their mom to make more sisters. Now, we know that the drive to reproduce is one of the strongest drives in animals. So when biologists first discovered these anthills and these beehives, where we have one reproductive female, we have a bunch of females who don't reproduce, and we don't have any males. Males are only produced during a certain time of the year that we'll talk about later, when the hive is going to make new queens. The real key to this is in genetics. So let's think about the genetics of eusocial organisms. And we want to look at two genetic relationships in particular. We want to look at a genetic relationship between a mother and her daughter. And we want to look at the genetic relationship between two sisters. Since bees are all females, pretty much, we don't care about males. So let's look at people first. So let's look at a human pedigree showing a family with 2 daughters, because we're going to look at the mother-daughter genetic relationship, and we're going to look at the sister-sister genetic relationship. So let's remember that when we look at a pedigree, circles are females and squares are males. So we're talking about people. So people have 46 chromosomes, or we often say they have 23 pairs. Remember those homologous chromosomes. So remember that a typical person, you have 2 copies of chromosome number 1. You inherited 1 copy of number 1 from your mother in the egg cell. You inherited 1 copy of number 1 from your father in the sperm cell. All the way down to you have 2 copies of chromosome 22. You got 1 copy of 22 from your mother, 1 from your father. And notice when I say you have 2 copies of chromosome 22, that doesn't mean that genetically they're identical. You could get a chromosome from your mother with the instructions for blue eyes, and a chromosome from your father with the instructions for brown eyes. Now, children get 46 chromosomes. And 46 of those chromosomes, 23 come from the mother, 23 come from the father. And not just any 23. Remember that if we're talking about people, 1 copy of chromosome number 1 comes from mom. 1 copy of number 1 comes from dad. All the way down to 1 copy of 22 comes from each parent, and 1 sex chromosome, either an X or a Y, comes from each parent. So mom has 46 chromosomes. Her daughter gets 23 of those. So the genetic similarity between daughter and her mother is 50%, or 1/2. Half of the chromosomes in a daughter were in her mother. Now, why do we care about this? Well, remember what we've said before. Organisms have to reproduce. That's the biological drive. And really the drive is to pass down as much of your DNA as possible. So every time a human mother produces a daughter or a son, we could have boys on here, we don't, but every daughter, every son gets half of her DNA. Now, this same thing is true for the father. His daughters get half his DNA. If we had a son here, his son would also get half his DNA. So let's think of the genetic relationship between 2 sisters. This is a little more complicated than with a mother and her daughter. So let's think about one girl. Out of her 46 chromosomes, a daughter gets 23 from her mother. So we said the genetic relationship was 50%. But if we're thinking about two sisters, what are the odds that two sisters get the same chromosomes from their mom? Well, notice if we take a female, a woman has 2 copies of chromosome number 1. She inherited 1 copy of number 1 from her father, 1 copy of number 1 from her mother. When she makes an egg cell, the odds are 50-50 that egg cell gets chromosome number 1 that she got from her mom. The odds are 50-50 that it gets chromosome number 1 that she got from her father. So in other words, if we look at a girl, she either inherits chromosome number 1 from mom that came from mom's mom, or she inherits chromosome number 1 that came from mom's dad. The chances that her sister gets the same chromosome are 50-50. Because if one girl inherits chromosome number 1 that her mother inherited from her grandmother, then the odds that her sister gets that same one are half. So if we look at sisters, half of the chromosomes come from the mom, and half of those chromosomes are genetically identical. So when we look at two sisters, 1/4 of their chromosomes, which means their genes, are the same. Now notice we could say the same thing with the genes, the chromosomes that come from the father. Each girl gets half of her chromosomes from her father. And the chances that she gets the same chromosome from her father as her sister did are 1/2. So 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4 again. So if we look at the genetic similarity between two sisters, 1/4 of their chromosomes are the same from the mother, 1/4 of their chromosomes are the same from the father. Or total is 1/2, the same as the genetic similarity between a mother and daughter. Now, so far the math is pretty boring. And tomorrow we'll get to some math that's not quite as straightforward. We aren't going to get 1/2 for everything, but it looks like we're about out of time. So are there any questions about what we talked about today? Tomorrow we'll get to the genetics of the ants and bees. Okay, if there are no questions, I will go ahead and let you go. Bye-bye, see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, question. Do we have a midterm?
No, we don't have a midterm. We will have another assignment, but your grade, when I have to turn the grades in, which is either the Monday that we're off or the Monday we come back. But your midterm grade is just whatever your average is at that point.
Okay. Also, what do you think about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
The evidence is that it's pretty good. They claim it's 100% effective in stopping death, but I'm not sure, that can be accurate. Probably 99.99% maybe.
Okay.
But the evidence is that it works very well. So, and the big advantage is it's one shot.
Right. I just got an email from my job. They said that they are, I guess they're piloting it at ORD for the flight attendants.
Good.
So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I got the first shot of the Pfizer and I had a sore shoulder for a day and a half, but that was really about the only side effect I had. So hopefully you won't have anything too bad. I've heard that some people have kind of like a mild cold-like symptoms, but I didn't get anything like that.
Well, we'll see. I still have to wait because I'm San Francisco based, but live here. So
Yeah, I didn't know if because of that they would let you get it here or what.
Yeah, I don't know yet. Probably not. I might have to wait a little bit. But we'll see. I'll let you know.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you. Good day.
You too. See you tomorrow.